I would like to greet everyone and welcome you. My name is Leah Middlebrook, and I am the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. On behalf of the center, I welcome you to the second lecture in our 2024-25 season of programming devoted to the theme of reimagine. Our events this year highlight the original human superpower, our mind's capacity to transform the world around us via imaginative thought. How might we use the human superpower of imagination or reimagination to engage creatively and critically with the circumstances of our lives? What new insights and research questions will be uncovered in the reimagining process? And what new, more equitable and nourishing pathways can be forged? Dr. Candace Bond-Theriault, our speaker today, addresses these questions under the auspices of our Colin Rowe Thomas O'Fallon Memorial Lecture in Law and American Culture. The O'Fallon Lectureship is the Oregon Humanities Center's longest standing endowed lectureship. The lecture was established by a gift from Henry and Betsy Mayer, named in memory of their nephew, the son of the late law professor James O'Fallon and his wife, Ellen Thomas. We at the OHC are deeply grateful to the O'Fallon and Mayer families for their tremendous vision and generosity in establishing and supporting this endowment, and we are delighted to have some members of the family with us today. Before introducing Dr. Bond-Theriault, I would also like to take a moment to express my deep appreciation for the OHC staff. Gina Turner, our Associate Director, Melissa Gustafson, Program Coordinator, and Peg Gerhardt, Communications Coordinator, for their efforts and labor on behalf of today's event. And speaking of communications, you will notice that the chat function is turned off right now. But as Dr. Bond-Theriault is speaking, please do note down your questions. And when she's concluded her talk, we will open the chat so that you can address your questions. They will come through me, and I'll be presenting them to Dr. Bond-Theriault. We open our events with a land acknowledgement developed by our colleagues in Native American and Indigenous Studies and in consultation with the Grand Ronde and Siletz tribes. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional Indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their Indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the University of Oregon, to the lands now known as Oregon, and to the world. In following the Indigenous Protocol of acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we also extend our respect to the 9 federally recognized Indigenous nations of Oregon, and we express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all displaced and Indigenous people who call this place, which we call Oregon, home. We give this land acknowledgement both to publicly honor the longstanding and ongoing relationships Kalapuya and other Indigenous peoples maintain with their homelands, and to remind ourselves and our institutions of our responsibilities and obligations as the bearers of this history. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Candace Bond-Theriault as our O'Fallon lecturer. Dr. Bond-Theriault is Senior Director of Policy of the Black Women's Health Imperative and an adjunct professor of sociology and criminology at Howard University. An experienced social justice lawyer, she has a strong demonstrated history of working in the political and civil rights industry. Prior to taking the position of Senior Director at the Black Women's Health Imperative, she was Associate Director for Movement Building at DEMOS, a nonprofit public policy organization working to build a just, inclusive, multiracial democracy and economy. She also served as Director of Racial Justice Policy and Strategy at the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia University, and as Associate Director for Policy Research and Strategy at Planned Parenthood of America. Her book, Queering Reproductive Justice, An Invitation, published in 2024 by the Stanford University Press, takes as its starting point a simple fact. We all have the human right to bodily autonomy, to sexual health and pleasure, and to exercising these rights with dignity. From there, Bond-Theriault uses a Black queer feminist lens to re-envision the seemingly disparate strands of the reproductive justice and LGBTQIA plus movements, drawing on US law, legislative history, healthcare policy, human rights, and interviews with academics and activists. The book presents incisive new recommendations for queer reproductive justice theory, organizing, and advocacy. We are delighted that she has joined us today to deliver her lecture, Queering Reproductive Justice, an invitation to create our collective future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Candace Bond-Theriault.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Oregon Humanities Center for having me. I really, really am excited to be here with you all and to be in space with you all. It's evening here, so it's 7 p.m. here. I know that you're in the afternoon. So happy afternoon, good evening to folks who are on the East Coast. I am Candace Bond-Theriault. I use she and her pronouns, and I really appreciated the land acknowledgement. That was beautiful. I'm calling to you from Northern Virginia, and I am on the lands of the Pohick tribe. So I always like to acknowledge that. And so I'm very excited to talk to you all about reimagining, especially in this moment. I feel like I want to create like this incubator of us, of this call, of the people in this call in this moment, because we deserve it. We deserve it. I won't sugarcoat it. We're in challenging times. Things are challenging. I live in Northern Virginia and the DMV, the DC metro area, and things are challenging. Things are challenging here. And unfortunately, I don't think things will get better first. I think things are we're going to see a little bit more, maybe a lot of bit more of things going awry and a lot of bad policy being put forth before things get better. That's generally been the case. But I do still think that we have a future to collectively create. And that is, in and of itself, is a very liberatory thought at this moment, that we all have a stake, that we all have a role to play in this collective future that we create together. And so I want to spend our time today really envisioning our collective future together and reminding ourselves, myself included, of the power of dreaming, the power of imagination, of reimagining. I've been spending a lot of time with my kiddos. I'm a mom of two. I have a 3-year-old and a 7-month-old baby. And in this moment, the moment that we're in a constitutional crisis, I still have to make snacks. I still have to get bath time ready. I still have to read bedtime stories. I still have to play with trains and cars and all the things. And that's bringing me so much joy and so much grounding at a moment where my anxiety could really just take me to a dark spiral. But I'm reminded that it's the little things that we do every day, the cup of coffee that I have in the morning. I'm just so grateful for that I get to have a cup of coffee in my kitchen and while the sun shines pouring in the windows. And it's times like these where those moments are really liberatory. And so I've been reading books to my kids for specifically for Black History Month, and we've moved to Women's History Month. And I am reading a book that is about little leaders dreaming big. And it really, to me, it's like little to me, I'm like big dreamers. I want to dream too. Like this, reading children's books, I think is just so cathartic and so beautiful because they're really for us too, as parents, to remind us that we too get to dream, that we haven't finished dreaming, that it's on us to show our children how to continue to dream. So that's kind of some of the work that I want to do today. And I also want to really note that dreaming right now of a liberatory future is just such a privilege. It is. It's a privilege to be in conversation with you all. It's a privilege when I'm every class that I teach, every time I go into my office at the Black Women's Health Imperative. It's a privilege to be in space with folks who are dreaming about creating a future because we don't always have the capacity to do that. I know that I don't. I know that there have definitely been times in my life, times in the last 6 weeks, where I just have to say, I just cannot any longer. I'm gonna put my computer away. I'm gonna go have a cup of tea. I'm gonna go do some yoga, and I'm just gonna turn it off. But it's a privilege always for me to come back to it and to really think about what we can create together because it's just too easy to get into a dystopian, fatalistic mindset that this is it, this is the end. And it's not unless we give in to that, unless we give in to this belief that there's nothing that we can do, that we are helpless and that there is no hope. There is always hope, even in the darkest of circumstances. And so that's why one of the reasons I'm just excited to speak with you because this beautiful belief of reimagining, I think, is just so important and so powerful right now. And there is no positive or liberatory or even a collective future that will exist if we don't do the work to create it now. Like we have to do the work. We don't have to do the work all the time. Like please take breaks, drink your water, get enough sleep, take your vitamins, but like please take breaks, but we have to get the work done now. And I really do believe that a liberatory collective future is possible, not only just 50 years from now, but 5 minutes from now. And sometimes it's about reimagining what future means. And I like, in quote, what future means. What is the future? The future is a long distance away, but the future is also this evening. The future is what are you doing with your evening that could be adding to liberatory joy for the future. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. And I also like to let folks know that it is 7 o'clock, so my kiddos are upstairs having dinner, and I have a dog that barks at squirrels, leaves, wind. So if you hear barking, it is my dog. Okay, can folks see this? Perfect. Okay, so for today's talk, I've broken it into three. I'm gonna move this. There we go. Move you guys to the bottom. I'm going to break it into three different parts. So part one is really about creating a broad vision for a collective future. Part two is to really dig into the current moment a little bit and talk about today's law and policy. And then part three is just really the invitation to continue to envision and create a collective future that is steeped in liberation and joy. Okay, so part one. So my book, my beautiful book, if you can see it, it's blurry. There you go. There you go. There. So Queering Reproductive Justice and Invitation. I wrote this book because I was doing this work. That's the long and short of it. There's amazing queering reproductive justice work that's being done out into the world. And so for me, I wanted to make sure there was a legacy of that work, to make sure that that work was being recorded, that future generations, current generations were made aware of this really great work that was being done already, and that this is a movement already at work. I did not create this movement. I did not found this movement. I did not even coin the term queer and reproductive justice. What I did do is create a framework for how I think we can think about queer and reproductive justice in action and in academic thought. And I brought together movement leaders from across the reproductive justice movement and LGBTQIA movement to really bring their voices and put them in this book because it's not just me. A movement is not just one person. And so for me, it was really important to showcase what movement building looks like in real time by including other voices that are not just mine throughout this book. Um, and I started my book with this, that queering reproductive justice is essential. And Black and brown LGBTQIA plus people deserve to live in splendor and abundance. We are worthy of positive and affirming experiences in this world and within the United States. We are deserving of equitable access to opportunities to become pregnant, have children, and build our families in safe and healthy environment. Black and brown, queer, transgender, gender nonconforming, and gender expansive people deserve to achieve reproductive justice. And I say that because those words are just so important to me. That is the why. That is where we're going. That is the visioning that I hope to get to. So how did I build this framework? So this is the framework. This is it. This is the framework that I'm utilizing throughout this talk, but that I really speak to throughout the entire book. So there are three pieces of the framework. It's really built from the reproductive justice framework, and it's queered. So we're queering reproductive justice in real time. So the first part of the framework is the right to not partner with others and to not have a child. The second is the right to create a family of one's choosing and to partner with one or more consenting persons, regardless of one's sexual orientation, gender identity, or sexual expression, as well as the right to have a child and build a family without regard to traditional forms of conception, pregnancy, birthing, or two-parent child rearing. And thirdly, the right to raise oneself and to raise one's family in safe and healthy environments, absent stigma, discrimination, and systemic institutional oppression. It's a lot. Queer and reproductive justice is a broad, expansive framework, and it was written for because intentionally in that way so that folks can take pieces from the framework and expand upon it. And so one of the reasons that my book is called Queering Reproductive Justice: An Invitation, it's because it's an invitation to ask other scholars to continue this work, to dive deep into a piece of this framework that resonates with them, for community organizers to find a piece of this framework to really organize around. It really is an invitation to join a sweeping movement. So the framework had to be expansive in order to match the work that's still being done on the ground. So ultimately, queering reproductive justice will be achieved when all people have the ability to determine if, when, and how to partner, parent, and raise oneself and one's family in safe and healthy environments. And this is important to me because for me, you're not going to know, you have to paint the picture. You have to know where you're going or you're not actually going to get there. If you don't name it, if you don't know what it looks like, what it feels like, what the environment, like what it smells like, what it tastes like, you're actually not going to get there. And so I think for each of us, we have to really name, what does collective liberation look like for us? What does queering reproductive justice look like for us? Because I have a definition that for myself of what it looks like when it's achieved. And I think that's incredibly important because the destination is not linear. We're not just going towards a destination that we're just going to reach and then it's just utopia and then we're kumbaya. I think that this is a cyclical process. Like you can find moments of queering reproductive justice, moments of collective liberation, moments of personal liberation as you're building collective movement building. And I think that's incredibly important because for me, liberation and joy look like drinking a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning while my kiddos are still asleep. Like I can still have that even as I'm fighting and for all of these policies that support and expand the rights for reproductive justice. So these are just some of the organizations that I like to pay homage to. Spark Reproductive Justice Now, Sister Song, one of the preeminent organizations of reproductive justice. There are so many academics that have been writing about the intersection of reproductive justice and LGBTQ liberation and equality for a long time. And then these are the movement perspective partners that I included throughout my book. So these are the organizations that I have in-depth interviews with throughout my book because I, again, am not the expert in every issue, but I know people who are the experts. So, for instance, I am not the expert in gender affirming care, but Whitman Walker Health is an expert in gender affirming care. They practice, their health centers practice and provide gender affirming services every single day. So, for me, it was important to highlight them and the work that they're doing. So, in order to get to queer and reproductive justice, you kind of have to build through reproductive justice and the reproductive movement. So, I just like to build these building blocks. So, reproductive health, meaning the services that are provided that people need in order to lead reproductive healthy lives. Like, this is more the provision of care that you have with your provider or a provision of care that you have with a pharmacy. This is really about the service itself of reproductive health care, where reproductive rights is about the legal rights to those healthcare. So, what are your legal rights regarding the getting birth control at a pharmacy? And then reproductive justice is the expansive lens around access and how do I access the rights and health that I'm guaranteed. And so reproductive justice, I do like to name that it was coined in 1994 by Black women in order to center the experiences and needs of Black women. And it merges human rights, it merges reproductive rights and social justice through a human rights lens. And these are the four meta rights of reproductive justice. So you have the right to have a child, to not have a child, the right to parent the children we have in safe and healthy environments, and then the right to bodily autonomy and sexual justice. And again, pay homage to them, say their names, make sure that they're in the space, because I and a lot of us in the movement owe a lot to these really revolutionary thinkers, and to Sister Song. So, just like reproductive movement, the LGBTQ movement is also multifaceted. And there's the LGBTQ liberation movement, the equality movement, the health movement. And LGBTQ liberation is the lens that I utilize throughout my book to queer reproductive justice. LGBTQ equality, an example of equality would be same-sex marriage. I think that's a quintessential example where the argument is LGBTQ people deserve the same rights that everyone else has as heterosexual, opposite sexual couples need or have in order to access marriage. So that is an LGBTQ equality argument, which is incredibly important. I think LGBTQ equality is necessary in the space. LGBTQ folks 100% full stop deserve the same rights that everyone has. LGBTQ liberation looks at the lens a little bit different and instead kind of looks through this lens of, okay, if we're talking about same-sex marriage, maybe the question isn't of course they should, LGBTQ folks have access to marriage, but maybe the question is marriage in it, looking at marriage in and of itself, is marriage actually necessary for anybody? And why are there only rights and privileges associated with marriage as an institution? Why aren't those rights and privileges provided to families that look different, that aren't of married couples, that are of individuals? So a liberationist lens looks at things around and outside of the current apparatus and kind of does a little bit of a deeper, more different lens than an equality argument is. But they're both incredibly important and they're both incredibly needed in order to really achieve collective liberation. It just kind of depends on what angle that you're utilizing. And for my book, I chose to look through an LGBTQ liberation lens because I found it to be a little bit more expansive to work through reproductive justice. And so to me, reproductive justice and LGBTQIA plus liberation are intertwined. Queer folks can get pregnant. We need access to contraception, have abortions, need access to culturally competent healthcare, treatments. And also, I think it's really important to talk about LGBTQ healthcare is beyond gender affirming care. LGBTQ healthcare is just healthcare for anyone that is LGBTQ. It doesn't have to be a specific type of healthcare. Like, I have asthma, like, and so I need access to asthma related services. My queer identity has nothing to do with whether I need treatment for asthma, but I still need treatment for asthma. So, like, it's still an LGBTQ healthcare service based on who I am. And so I think that there's kind of been this classification around what LGBTQ health services are, that kind of actually get in the way of remembering and that LGBTQ folks are whole people that need things just like everyone else. So my book is built on three foundations. The foundation of Black feminism, which I pay homage to the Shiro, the ancestor Audre Lorde, and her view of Black feminism. And I pull pieces from like Patricia Hill Collins, Angela Davis, and just these really amazing, to me, these phenomenal Black feminists. Melissa Harris Perry and her work on The Crooked Room is really important to my analysis of queering reproductive justice. And then the second piece is intersectionality. And so intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in a Law Review article where she made the case that the law finds it really difficult and utterly impossible to recognize sex and race at the same time. So look at Black womanhood, for instance. Instead, you can argue a case based on race discrimination, you can argue a case based on gender or sex-based discrimination, but you can't argue a case based on gender and race discrimination intersectionally. And so in her law review article, she really just makes that distinction. And so this term is just incredibly important because we all have intersections, we all have identities, and intersectionality is just how do those identities interplay with one another. The next piece of the analysis is the power, privilege, and oppression piece. So if intersectionality is the first level, you want to know what, for instance, my intersections are. Like, I identify as a Black queer woman. Okay, those are my intersections. Power, privilege, and oppression is the next analysis, which will determine what those power dynamics are based on my identities when I move through space, because power dynamics are ever shifting. When you're alone, you have a power dynamic. When you bring one other person into the room, there's a power dynamic. And certain buildings that you're in, when you're at your job, when you're with your friends, when you're with your family, there's always these power dynamics. And usually with power, the way that power works is that there are folks that are put in positions of privilege and positions of oppression. And a lot of times in US culture and US society, your identity markers put you in these positions of privilege and oppression, usually systemically, like without anything that you have done, without any, without even opening your mouth, you're put into these positions of whether you exist within a privileged position or within a position of one that is more likely to experience oppression based on power dynamics. And I could give a whole lecture on intersectionality and power dynamics. I find it fascinating. I would love to write more about shifting power and power dynamics because I think it is really interesting around how we can think about policy solutions if you're thinking about it through a power, privilege, and oppression lens. But it starts with a baseline of intersectionality. And so I use these three concepts throughout my book to inform what queering reproductive justice is and looks like. And then lastly, the book is based on three major concepts. The first is the rejection of state control and criminalization. The second is the government's role, making sure the government has a role in playing a part in the liberation of its people. And the third calls for the development of social programs that actually aid individuals and families. So, part two. the current moment, looking a little bit deeper at today's law and policy. And so I have a whole chapter on queering the right to not have children. And these are just a couple of the sections that are in that chapter. But for today, I really just want to take a minute to talk about queering abortion. It's a very hot topic. We all know what happened in 2022 with the Dobbs case. And I'll talk about that for just a minute. But I did want to just give some of these statistics that I think are very expansive and important to name, that bisexual and lesbian women and gender expansive folks all need access to abortion. And studies have found that the majority of lesbian and bisexual women have reported having intercourse with men. At least 30% have become pregnant, and 16% have reported one or more abortions. And then there are also studies that have looked at sexual violence, recognizing that bisexual women are have a heightened level of sexual violence experiences compared to heterosexual women, 46% compared to 17%. And unintended pregnancies are equally as common, if not more common, for lesbian and bisexual women as for heterosexual women. I and then the last statistic I will throw at you is around um, young folks. And so this is not for adolescents, young queer women are more likely than their counterparts to experience unintended pregnancy. And one of the big reasons is because of lack of sexual education that is competent in queer matters. If folks listening to this call, if you had sex education in the United States, you probably had a very small educational experience when it came to sex ed. Growing up in Virginia, it was very small experience of sex education. Um, and it was so small and it was not really inclusive of anyone, let alone LGBTQ folks. So a lot of time bisexual and lesbian young folks are missed, and there's an assumption that sex will not produce a child or a pregnancy. And so obviously that's not the case for many. And a 2016 study by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention found that LGBT high school students are more likely than other students to experience intimate partner violence, which also results in high levels of unintended pregnancy. Um, Dobbs. I just have to talk about Dobbs. I feel like you can't have a talk around reproductive justice in 2025 and not talk about Dobbs. I'm not going to go into it, but what Dobbs did was overruled Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and overruled the authority to regulate abortion. It has been returned to the states and their elected representatives, and basically gutted the constitutional protection of abortion in the United States. Um, and I do like to name the that Samuel Alito wrote the opinion for this case. Um, and he creates this new test called the deeply rooted in our nation's history test. And I like to say that he says that abortion is not deeply rooted in our nation's history, which is why he could not protect it, because it's not deeply rooted. And he gives a lot of receipts, in his opinion, receipts that say, abortion wasn't a law in 1700 and abortion didn't exist in this year. He actually referred to a 1727 Virginia law around abortion, and that actually distinguished between free women and enslaved women. So in his Supreme Court decision, he was actually in his footnotes utilizing antebellum law, which is really fascinating. Not talked about a lot, but really fascinating. But it's just something to think about of what is deeply rooted in our nation's history. So what for Justice Alito is worthy of protection and what is not. He did not say. But Clarence Thomas did. Justice Thomas concurred, and he pretty much asked the court, or not the court, but gave a nod to looking at other substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, which is the Supreme Court case that gave the right to contraception for married couples. Lawrence v. Texas, which granted the right to same-sex privacy for consensual relationships, and then Obergefell v. Hodges, which of course granted the right to same-sex marriage. And so Justice Thomas, in his concurring opinion, gives a nod to these cases. And it's just important to note these are all important cases for queer and reproductive justice. Lawrence and Obergefell are directly related to LGBTQ marriage and health, and they're just things to be on the lookout in the future. I do also like to name that queering Dobbs. In my book, I write about this a lot, but for now, I will just name that Dobbs was really written in a ciscentric opinion, which is not uncommon. That's what it is. That's where we are. That's 20, this was 2022. But the act in question did actually not name a woman's pregnancy and did not use gender. Um, it explicitly names a woman's pregnancy, is not use gender neutral or gender inclusive language. But the court really articulated abortion as a woman's issue over and over. And what we know is that is actually not the case only. Yes, it is a women's issue, but a lot of people who do not identify as women also seek and have abortions. And so just looking at the language, I think is incredibly important. And it's an example of what queer and reproductive justice does as a framework, is kind of look deeper at the language. There was actually an LGBTQ amicus brief that was filed in this case by a group of LGBTQ national organizations talking about the specific harm that Roe and Casey being overruled would have on LGBTQ reproductive health. So I definitely think folks should check that opinion, that amicus brief out, because it's really well done and lays out the argument really for queering reproductive justice and abortion. I also want to say that abortion is a human right. The reproductive justice framework is a human rights framework. And while in the US, abortion is not, it has been said to not be a constitutional right, it is still a human right. And that's important because sometimes I need to remind myself that there are other frameworks that exist out there that are human rights frameworks that are beyond borders and beyond US specific law. Um, I just wanted to name the importance of the importance of abortion clinics, because they provide services beyond abortion, like birth control, and a lot of queer and trans folks receive their health care from abortion clinics, and so it's really important to protect clinics. I'm just naming here that I have a whole chapter on religious exemptions and denying care to LGBTQIA plus people that we're not going to talk about today. That's a whole nother conversation, but I just like to note that that's in there. Chapter 4 really is on the right to have children and parent. And queering family formation, I think, is incredibly important. I talk about assisted reproductive technologies, but also what it means to exist as a family that looks heteronormative from the outside, but may not be, because one of the members of the family is bisexual or identifies as queer. So there are a lot of families that are queer families that may not look like queer families on the outset, which I think is incredibly important to note. So queer and reproductive justice discusses the human right to partner or not partner, and discusses marriage as not being should not be a mandate for family building, which kind of gets into that LGBTQ liberationist view that I was speaking about a little bit earlier. I also talk about the importance of recognizing asexual folks who choose not to partner. And so what does it mean if you don't partner are you deserving of the same rights as people who choose to partner? I would argue yes. But it's also just something to think about. Queering motherhood and parenthood is one of my favorite topics to think about and to talk about. Um, because for me, this gets in, I talk a lot in my book about healing justice and utilizing healing justice as a frame in which to queer reproductive justice. In queering motherhood, queering parenthood, some of it starts with raising ourselves. And so I say that in the framework earlier, and sometimes it's a little like, what does that mean? I mean, raising oneself is the unlearning that we each have to do as we get older, as we learn more information, unlearning maybe some things that we learned, particularly around like sex ed, unlearning some things that we learned that may not have been accurate, evidence-based, based in fact or reality, and learning the things that we need to know in order to live holistic lives in 2025. It's a constant process, like raising ourselves. I think particularly for queer folks and queer families, I may not have had the person to tell me all the things that I needed to know as a young child or as a young adult. But now that I have the information, I'm able to relearn and kind of grow that little person inside of me who still is yearning for mentorship. And sometimes you have to mentor yourself. And Audre Lorde talks about this a lot. I said earlier, she's one of my sheroes. I have her book right here on my desk. Sister Outsider is my favorite. I don't know if you can see it. It's my favorite Audre Lorde text. Um, I pick it up. I have it right here because I pick it up whenever I just need to be seen and just to feel like that's one of the powers of literature, that it's just forever, just the words. I'll just take a minute. So she talks a lot about mothering ourselves, and I just think it's incredibly beautiful. And then I have a chapter 4. I know that we're getting to time, so I'm actually going to move to this last piece of envisioning and creating a collective future steeped in liberation and joy. And I want to end with this piece around an invitation to believe. That's how I end my book, because talking about all the pieces that are needed to queer reproductive justice are hard. Like, this is hard work. This is not easy. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next week. It probably is not going to happen in my lifetime. Hopefully, it happens in my kid's lifetime. We'll see. But this is an invitation to believe in the possibility. And so I had the privilege what was it, in 2017 to be a part of an organization called Rockwood, and it's a leadership organization, and I was part of a reproductive health rights and justice collective. And so 2017, I think, what was happening there. It was year 1 of the first Trump administration. And so for me, a lot of what I'm seeing, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm getting deja vu um, from my work. But all of these reproductive justice leaders came together and we created a statement together. And I end my book with this because if I ever am doubting what the moment has, like what's going on in the moment, what my future has to offer, I read this statement and it just gives me so much joy and hope. And so I'm going to read it to you all after I take a sip of water. So this is our vision statement. In our vision for the world, we experience pleasure without shame and pain, without trauma. Accountability equals trust and relationship and community. We acknowledge the harm of white supremacy and divest from those structures and systems. After reparations, redistribution, and reconciliation, there will be an extended period of healing, out of which emerges a new world. We can all feast from tables and be restored by beds that nourish us in ways we need. We envision a world where people have reverence for life, art, and culture. There's space to heal. In this beautiful, borderless world, people will have access to the support and resources they want and need to live fulfilled and dignified lives. We all experience the joy of families of our design, playing in summer. We are liberated in how we value the sacred in all of us. We create the conditions in which people can live their most authentic lives, in balance with the earth and with each other. Hashtag harmony. Because of the interconnected collectivist system, people will have the freedom to express creativity and joy through radical leisure. And I will dedicate this to one of the authors of this statement who recently passed away, Koya Whitehoke Artichoker. I'm going to dedicate that statement to her. And that's where I will end and take questions.
Thank you so much for your talk, Candace. This was a really beautiful and stirring invitation, and I'm sure we have many questions coming in. Right now, we're getting messages of thanks for your talk. Um, Perhaps as we wait for people to chime in the chat. I mean, I have a whole list, but I was interested in the last part of your talk when you were talking about Audre Lorde. You were thinking about the right to parent ourselves, and when I was looking at the women's health imperative, the Black women's health imperative, I noticed that there's an emphasis in the website on intergenerational collaboration and experience. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about intergenerational strategies for sharing experiences and forming alliances and helping build these movements.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And so for me, intergenerational storytelling, collective work is really the only way that we're going to get to liberation because it's not going to happen just in our lifetimes. It's a lifespan. It's connecting with, for me, connecting with my elders and teaching my children. That's how we keep collective liberation movement moving. And for me, growing up in the South as a Black person, growing up in the South, storytelling and intergenerational work has always been a part of the mission and the work of liberation and achieving civil rights and basic human rights. Um, and so for me, if you're not thinking about how, for instance, like a policy affects someone who's in their 70s, but also or someone who is 7, you're missing the point. You can't just think about one specific set of folks. Yes, like specific policies do focus on focus on specific folks, but when you're talking about liberation, like liberation is for everyone. And so to me, thinking intergenerationally, multi-generationally is really important. It's about sitting around those, kitchen table conversations that have my mom and, that I sat around with my mom and my grandmother and how I hope to sit around the table with my mom and my daughter when she's not, when she's older than 7 months, can sit. But having those conversations around the lessons that we're all learning in the current moment and what people have to teach us. I'm talking to elders all the time right now, especially because I'm like, how did you do it? Tell me about like what was going on during the Reagan administration. Like, help me out. And trying to find wisdom from all that they've been through and, the things that they've seen that aren't written in the history books that I'm not getting information about except for from first person storytelling.
Thank you for that. We have a question here. Kristen Yaros wanted to know, I was wondering if you could speak to how abolition has informed your work. How does abolition help us move away from liberal rights-based claims to reproductive health of the past and towards intersectional organizing for our collective future?
It's a great question. That's a huge question. I intentionally did not discuss abolition a lot in my book because for me, it's such a big concept. And I at times was like, okay, I'm gonna put it in here, and then I was like, that doesn't fit. Like, I'm gonna put it in here, and this does not fit. And I was just like, I couldn't find exactly where it fit because it was just too big, um, to really dive into because. I think that there are just that's its own book around queer and reproductive justice and abolition and reproductive justice and abolition. Like that book has been written by Angela Davis. Like she is the preeminent scholar when it comes to abolition movements. I have her book right behind me. Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and she wrote a great book a couple years ago about abolition and feminism. I think it was called abolition feminism or something like that. And to me, like the work it has is being done already. And so for me, it's my job to figure out how does queer and reproductive justice in this current framework that I'm speaking to, like, how do we work together in abolitionist spaces? Um, and I think that there's also just a misclassification a lot of times of what abolition is and what abolition means. And there's just a lot of learning, unlearning, teaching that has to happen in the abolition space. So it's a really big question. That was a really small answer because I intentionally did not dive into the abolitionist space, but it's something that I still grapple with.
Thank you. We have another question here. How do you clear your mind of what is going on right now to enjoy time with yourself and your community and your family? Can you talk about your relationship with balancing life enjoyment and the work that you do? And then, as a second important question, where can I ethically buy your book? Excellent question. And then as a third part of the question, do you have any book recommendations on bisexuality specifically? So I think the headline question here is how do you clear your mind and balance your relationship between work and enjoyment? And then there are some bibliographical questions.
So I am a yogi. I am an avid yogi. I try to practice every day. I don't get to practice every day as a mom, but I try to, even if it's for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I right before the COVID pandemic hit, I was certified to teach yoga, so I started teaching some classes. And then during the pandemic, I made this radical decision for myself that I was actually not going to teach yoga because I loved it too much. And sometimes when you love something, you should just be able to get to enjoy it. You don't have to lead it and you don't have to monetize it. And that was like radical for me, where I was just like, I love it so much that I just want to practice. And so that helps me a lot. I, I do a lot of meditation. I walk my dog. Physical, like I'm a kinesthetic learner. So because I know how I learn, that's also how I decompress. So I decompress kinesthetically. So I like to do things. Like I like to make things with my hands. I like to physically do things. And I think yoga is a great pathway for me. Like I have to move in order to sit down and meditate. I can't just like sit down and shut my mind off. I have to move. And so I utilize that throughout my life. I also have a mantra that I like to use when things are kind of like getting too heady and like too much, um, for my mind to meet me where my body is. And so that helps me become present. So, like, if I'm right now speaking to you all at my desk, like, that's where my mind is. My mind's not on what my to-do list is after, what my to-do list is for tomorrow, what I did earlier today. Like, can my mind be in this chair with my body? And that really helps me center and ground myself. And so I love a good mantra. I also love astrology. I just think it's fun. I mean, I don't know. I would consider myself spiritual, not religious, just like any other millennial, like every millennial that exists out there. Um, but I find astrology to be really calming for me. And so just, I don't know, something to me about the stars. Like I look up at the stars and I look up at the moon and I follow the moon cycle and I'm just like my parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. Like I'm just calm. Like I look at the night sky and my body is calm. And so I love that. Like it makes me excited for nighttime, for clear skies, for seeing what my horoscope is. I don't know, I don't like necessarily believe in it, but I think it's fun. I like to just read my horoscopes for my kids because I think it's fun. I'm like, oh my gosh, my 7th month old has like a really important meeting this week that she has to like make this life change. Like it's just really fun to me. So I like to find humor in life. Oh, and you can buy my bookstore or books. You can buy my book at bookshop.org, which will be a local book retailer near you.
Thank you. Here's a great question. Do you have any insights on how students that don't study or work within the realm of social justice can still resist the violence of the current climate in their day-to-day lives?
I mean, I think if you were asking that question, you probably already know how to still resist violence and resist some of this in day-to-day lives. I think a lot of the things that many of us, I will speak for myself, have taken for granted in the social justice space, like being able to talk about abolitionism, be able to talk about intersectionality, is going to become censored, become radical. And so continuing to educate ourselves and continuing to talk in spaces that may not be super welcoming to those concepts any longer is a way to continue them, to keep them alive, is a practice of Black feminism, of storytelling, of reminding ourselves that we deserve to tell our stories. Celebrating Women's History Month. Like, it shouldn't be radical to celebrate Women's History Month. Like, when did that become radical? But like, it's International Women's Day on Sunday or Saturday, and I'm like, what a radical day, like to celebrate. So I think some of it is just celebrating and not letting folks silence things that you once took for granted and just keeping those, continue to claim those pieces.
You have stamina for a few more?
Yes.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. Someone wanted to know about tips for talking about these issues with children, especially LGBTQIA plus children who may be having a hard time seeing themselves in the future right now, especially as children are not always able to imagine waiting decades for answers or for gratification.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm teaching my kids about all the things right now about race and American politics. Like I'm teaching my 3-year-old right now, and I think all the time about queer youth in this moment. It's just been such a horrible, rough moment for queer young people, particularly like those that sweet spot of folks realizing what's going on, but not fully understanding or like not fully knowing that things can get better is a really hard place to be in. I think for myself and the queer communities that I'm a part of, like we all had that moment of young adulthood, young adolescence of kind of like figuring everything out, but like not like this, not in this political moment where like people are saying negative things about your person, about your whole existence in a really public forum, I think is new for it's a new phenomenon that queer youth of today really have to grapple with. But also the reality is that youth of the past, like in, my heritage, Black youth of the past experienced this. day in and day out for hundreds of years. And were talked about as non-human. Like there is precedent for that in this country, maybe not around LGBTQ issues and youth in particular, but around people of color, around immigrants, around indigenous folks. Um, Kids have been growing up and becoming of age in this country for 400 years in really harsh circumstances. And so there are only, it's one type of group really that I can think of that has the privilege to not really think about these harsh realities. But the truth is, many of us had to or have to. I took a class on when I got my driver's license. You take driver's ed to get your driver's license. So everyone took driver's ed, but my parents made me take this class called Driving While Black because I had to learn what it meant to be driving as a black person in Virginia to get that information. And so that's not easy. That wasn't an easy concept. And so things for a lot of people haven't always been easy. And I think that there are lessons that folks can teach and share about how they got through that movement, how they got through those harsh times when they didn't think things would get better. So part of it is just finding community and sharing those stories.
Thank you for that answer. I want to, I think we'll close here, but I wanted to give us all an opportunity one more time to applaud over our screens, thanking Dr. Candace Bond-Theriault for spending the time that you spent with us today. I think we all really appreciated everything you had to say, and we're glad to be able to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that my voice has been going in and out. So I'm glad that it made it. I made it.